Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out on this very early spring-like day. We are both so excited about this talk today, partly because this is a project that started basically from the beginning of Kay's beginnings with the University Guild. Now, this was one of those sort of mysteries that landed on her desk that I had been interested in, that many of the other guild members had been interested in, and Kay Hamill, who has that way about her, found the other Kay, and that's how all of this got started. And so, my trusty collection manager and I are going to set you all down this same journey that the two of us has been taking, that culminated in a very exciting visit last week the Museum of Science and Industry, where our story begins. In fact, it begins really in the basement of the Museum of Science and Industry, where this very interesting artifact lies today, as you can see, right next to some fruit and vegetable cans. Now, this vase, I'm sure some of you have some familiarity with, whether you saw it on view here in Evanston, or if you've just heard tell of the 500-pound vase from the University Guild's collection. In fact, there's a whole fascinating history, not just of the vase's return to the Guild in the 1980s, but going all the way back to the 1890s and the Columbian Exposition. Now, it's really an extraordinary artifact. It's hard to tell from these images of the vase alone its scale. So I'm going to show you a photo of someone standing next to it. And I'll tell you, I've seen this image many a time, and still, and I'm coming a little bit ahead of myself here, seeing it in person, I was still not prepared for how big this vase is. And so this is just a little bit of an introduction to get you all started. And now Kay is going to talk to you as sort of the voice of the vase, starting back in the 1890s when this vase is born, so to speak.
When Frances E. Lewis was first introduced to Sir Henry Dalton in 1874, her art master said this about her: "She has a remarkable power of design and a skill in painting that is seldom surpassed. Her designs are of flowers and foliage and birds, and whether she is working out a really large design or a small tile, her energy and her power are equally apparent." So in the 1880s, Florence and her sister rapidly advanced in China painting. They were decorating vases and plaques and tiles and dishes, and Florence ultimately took the lead in her department, and she was teaching 70 students. So by 1890, Florence Lewis is one of the most highly acclaimed artists at the Dalton Studios. In 1890, a 20-year-old prince comes to the studio, and he wants to talk about a commission. He wants to talk about a commission for his just completed palace, a palace 4 times the size of Buckingham Palace, situated on 500 acres. He's walking around the studio, and he quickly takes note of Florence's work. He goes on to give the Dalton Studio the largest commission they will ever receive. It's a commission for a 500-pound, 6-foot vase at a cost of $6,000. But when that vase came out of the kiln, there was just a very slight flaw, a slight flaw. And so a sister vase is made for the Indian prince. Now Florence Lewis will go on and she will receive many more commissions for this Indian prince. And Sir Henry Dalton will go on to prepare a shipment of his finest pieces to come to the Columbian Fair in 1893. And that 6-foot-tall vase will be the centerpiece in the pavilion.
So many of you have heard me at some point or another talk about the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. Now, this was a really pivotal moment both for the University Guild and for Chicago collecting more broadly. A number of different museums in the Chicago area have collecting roots in the Chicago World's Fair. And that's because it was a fabulous opportunity to travel the world and collect, all without leaving Chicago. And not just the different pavilions of different countries where you could travel to China and India and purchase goods made by artisans from those places. There were also industrial pavilions where you could go to, say, the Royal Worcester Pavilion and buy porcelain, and in, of course, our case, the Royal Dalton Pavilion. Now, this comes into our story because in 1892, the women of the University Guild are concerned about the presence of arts on campus. They're worried that Northwestern is putting too much emphasis on STEM, what we would call today STEM, engineering, math, science, the hard sciences, and they want to make sure that the student body has, a more balanced curriculum. And so they light on Lunt Library as being a good site to have a sort of gallery of their collection that they are going to build. And what better opportunity to build this collection than the World's Fair? Lucky enough, these ladies have a connection.
So in 1893, the Guild is only 1 year old. Bertha Palmer was really good friends with Cornelia Lunt and Emma Rogers. Now, Emma Rogers is she is the wife of the first president. And Bertha Palmer knows that they're on the Guild. They're members here. And Bertha knows that they want to start this collection. And so Bertha tells the committee, we need to go shopping because the Columbian Fair, the exhibitors there, they're going to lower their prices at the end of the fair. They're bringing them down because they would rather sell at a reasonable price than wrap and pack and ship it all back. And so the art committee went to work and they did some fundraising, and they had their purses stuffed with money. They had their purses stuffed with money from Potter Palmer and Orrington Lunt. And that summer, they went shopping at the fair over 22 times. They did begin a love affair with the big vase. Now, they shopped and they bought from other exhibitors. They bought the glass, they bought the porcelain, but they could not take their eyes off that big vase. And so they met with the pavilion's manager. Mr. Ford had that vase priced at $6,000, and the ladies got the price down to $600. Mr. Ford had a soft spot for these ladies because he knew they were starting this collection, and he said, in addition to this vase, I'm gifting you other pieces of Dalton. And so they had the big vase. They had about 18 maybe more pieces of Dalton, and everything comes back up here to the campus. And it is on display in Lunt Library, the second floor. It's on display until 1915, when there's a knock on the door and Northwestern Library says, oh, our collections are growing so fast and we're going to need this space. And so we'll take all this art, we'll pack it, we'll crate it, we'll protect it, and when there's a space big enough, you'll have it back. The vase disappears.
So part of what has been so exciting about doing this project is getting to dig into some of these stories that I was familiar with but maybe hadn't seen photos of before. And this high-res image of Lunt Library that we were only able to access because of the help of Bill Burlingham and also the wonderful NU librarians, we had never seen it in this level of detail before. This is the Great Vase on display with other items in the University Guild collection. One thing I want to point out, this isn't only a decorative arts or a fine arts collection. They see all of this different work as being valuable for the students to use as reference material. And something else interesting about this very cool high-res image is that we can see the frieze behind the big vase. And you will see it is a frieze of women decorating pottery that looks awfully familiar from those images of the Royal Dalton factory that we showed you already. Now, just to give you a little taste of how ongoing and exciting of a project this is, today, this morning, Kay and Bill found on the list of items that went to the Museum of Science and Industry this frieze. And we learned that this frieze came from the Royal Dalton Company. And so very possible that this image of the women painting the vases was done by Florence or her students as well. And so I'm just all of this amazing history that we're still trying to unpack. But I am going to bring us up to 1940. And that is when Scott Hall is fundraised for by the Guild and other women's organizations, and it opens. And it's time for the collection to come back. But as Kay will talk about, there may not be room for everything.
So in 1940, the Guild moves in to this finished building, and members are acquainting themselves with pieces of art that have been packed away for 25 years. They are so excited because this space now has wooden cabinets and there's locks and everything will be protected, but it is not all going to fit. And so that summer, the women are constantly arranging and rearranging collections, and they're sitting things out because they know it's going to be downsizing time. However, the curator, she writes a letter to the Museum of Science and Industry, and she tells them, we have this art collection, and some of the pieces were purchased at the Columbian Exposition, and we have to downsize, and so would you like to come and have a look? And so the museum writes back, oh yes, if you are considering making a gift, we would be very, very happy to have a look. And so the curator writes to the board. It's about a month later, she writes this letter. In 1893, charter members raised large sums of money, and they purchased, not wisely, but too well, a host of ornate, finely made, and for the most part, ugly pieces of porcelain and pottery, which had been shown by various European artists at the Columbian Exposition. And so yes, they're going to come and take a look. And so she tells the board, she says, you know, we have some pieces that are really, really ugly. So would you come with me on May 28th? We'll go to the lower storeroom over here at the Rogers house and bring your best ideas on how we might dispose of some of these items.
Now, I'm just coming in for a brief interlude to speak up for my colleague from, almost 100 years ago. It's hard to say objectively whether any piece is ugly or not, and I certainly today would not use that kind of language in professionally organizing a collection. But it's sort of an interesting point that she's making. By 1940, this style of early 90s, very ornate Victorian style pottery was very out of fashion. And you think Bauhaus, Art Deco, modernism, you wanted these sleek, simple silhouettes that could not have been further from what you're seeing here. And this is the period where Victorian houses are being torn down. And I think today we look at that and see a lot of that as being a little misguided. Well, these are beautiful historic pieces, but we are not free of these subjective ideas either. You think of something like the Thompson Center downtown, postmodern office building that I see a lot of you rolling your eyes about right now. I guarantee you in 20 years there will be people just as upset that that's being torn down and changed as there were by the 80s about something like this being considered unattractive too. And so part of what our job is, working with a collection like this, is to try and think of it not just subjectively over whether it's ugly or not, but as a historic object. What do these things tell us about the collection, about people, and about society? And so, just a little note on the ugly vase of it all.
And so the Guild was told that the Museum of Science and Industry would take the pieces of art. They would have an identification tag on each piece of art. So it would be connected again, all this art, with this University Guild. So in late 1940, the art goes to the Museum of Science and Industry, and the vase disappears. In 1982, an appraiser is walking around the sub-basement, one of the sub-basements of the museum, and he's preparing items to showcase for the museum's 50th anniversary. He's walking around in this basement area, and he's back in the corner, and he sees a crated vase next to the canned goods, the canned vegetables. And so it's pears and tomatoes and big vase. And so he's asking the administration, do you have any idea, what is this? Where did it come from? Why do we have it? And 1 year later, that big vase is on exhibit at the museum as the visitors are celebrating the museum's 50th anniversary. Okay, so then a few years later, it's 1985 or so, we have a Guild archivist here in Scott Hall, and she's going through the historic files, and she's reading material because the Guild is getting ready for our 95th anniversary. And she's reading that back in 1893, the Guild bought the largest vase ever made by Dalton Pottery. And she's reading on that there was a clerk at Northwestern, and he did record all these pieces of art that went down there, but he wasn't real specific with, descriptions. And so the big vase, it was forgotten about. Well, with this big anniversary coming, the ladies in the art committee, they decide, let's grab our purses and our pearls and let's head down there. Let's go see what we gave away. Little did these ladies know that there's another woman in town and she's looking for that big vase too. Her name is Louise Irvine. Louise Irvine is a historian for the Royal Dalton Pottery Studio. Now, Louise Irvine has come in from London because she is working on an exhibit, a Dalton exhibit at Marshall Fields. And she's here in town because she wants to make all these connections. London, Dalton, Chicago, Columbian Exhibition. Louise read that Northwestern had purchased the vase. So Louise, she's writing to the Block Gallery. And that summer, the letters are going back and forth. Well, there's nobody here at the Guild in the summer. There's nobody here. And so the letters are here, and then late summer, the women come in, review the mail, and they say, oh my gosh, Louise Irvine is here. They connect with her. And they say, Louise, would you come up to Scott Hall and we'll show you what's left, what we still have in this collection? So Louise does come up, and she says, you know, I really want to see a picture of that vase. That's what do you have? And they did not. They said, we are so sorry, but all we have is that historic file taken back on the second floor of Lunt Library in 1915. And Louise says, it's okay. I'm going to the museum tomorrow. I will take a picture of I'll take a picture of the vase because I'm writing a story for the Royal Dalton Collectors Club. And I'll use that photo. That'll be the centerpiece of my article. And so that's exactly what happens. Now, there's something else happening here. There is a member of the Guild by the name of Mary Burlingham, and she's getting agitated over all of this. She went to the museum, and she saw that vase is not on exhibit. That vase does not have an identification plate. And so maybe the museum, maybe they're not living up to all of our expectations. And what if we tried to get a short-term loan? Or better yet, what if we got the vase back? And so the curator she's getting curious, and she says, well, what would it take? What would it take to bring that vase back to Scott Hall? We have an anniversary coming. Maybe they'll just give it back to us. Well, Mary Burlingham, she is a force to be reckoned with. She is 90 years old. And she says, I know what I can do. I'll start writing letters. And so Mary Burlingham, she did launch a fast and furious letter writing campaign. It is the 80s. You don't pick up a phone, you don't make a call, you write letters. So the letters are going to start. She's going to write back to Louise, who's in London, and she's asking for suggestions. How do I do this? How do we get the vase back? A short-term loan. What is your best idea? And she also says, Louise writes back and says, well, I'm writing this article, and when that vase is, front and center in the article, that will draw some attention to your cause. And so Louise then Mary Burlingham then invites Louise back up here to speak at Scott Hall when she does come back to Chicago to talk about the Dalton collection. So it's 1986 now, and Mary Burlingham is writing letters. She is writing appeals for help, advice, suggestions, recommendations to people who can help her. She's in constant contact with Louise Irvine. She is writing to the director over here at the Block Gallery. She is writing to the coordinator of collections down at the Museum of Science and Industry. She is writing to Daniel Terra, the ambassador of cultural affairs and founder of the Chicago Terra Museum of Art. She's writing to her nephew, Milo Nev. He is the first curator in American arts at the Art Institute in Chicago. And she is writing to the president of Northwestern, Arnold Weber. Louise Irvine does confirm that she will come to Chicago, and she is suggesting that perhaps she could get the museum to loan the vase to Marshall Field. It's much closer to the museum. And maybe she'll have some luck, but she's going to wait to see if Mary Burkland is successful. So late that summer, the museum does write to the Block Gallery and says we will allow some pieces to come. We'll let you know as soon as the final decision is made. And weeks later, the approval is given for the big vase to come back to Scott Hall. There were some stipulations. The Guild would have to have a large glass case built. It would need low light, it would need ventilating fans and a security system. And a ceramics engineer would need to construct a base, a support system for the interior of the vase so that it could support a lid. And they did it all. The Guild met all of those requirements. By now, Mary Burkland is 92 years old. And after years of letter writing and discussions and meetings and negotiations, she saw the move completed. There was a huge celebration, a huge party, and Mary Burkland saw the vase here, and Louise Irvine was on hand to pull the cord and do the big reveal. Everyone in this room, all the members, all the guests, they had champagne and they celebrated and cheered the big event.
Now, this story, the idea that there was a 500-pound vase that had somehow gotten lost in the mix and ended up in the basement of the Museum of Science and Industry, only to be moved with much fanfare up to Northwestern, was something that garnered a bit of press for the University Guild. This was a story people were interested in for this connection to the Chicago World's Fair and for the novelty of the story of this enormous vase traveling the city. Like Kay said, Louise Irvine comes to Chicago to do a talk on the vase. She is there on hand for the party where it's unveiled. And I think it's particularly interesting. This vase that in 1893 is considered beautiful and interesting enough to be the centerpiece of Royal Dalton's Pavilion, and then to be accessioned into the collection of this new arts club at Northwestern. Only 50 years after that or so is it considered so ugly that it shouldn't even be kept in storage. It should be shipped off to another museum as soon as possible. Another 47 years after that or so, it's valuable enough again from a historic perspective that we have a scholar here coming all the way across an ocean in order to see it in person here in situ at the University Guild. And so again, part of the value of our collection, more broadly, besides just this vase, is the idea that all of these pieces have a story like this, of its collecting history, of the value that the women in the guild put on these objects. And that's part of why we are such a unique collection compared to others. Now, the interest in this vase on Louise's part does not end.
So in 2002, the museum wrote to the Guild asking, do you want the loan extended? And the Guild said, absolutely yes. In 2008, the museum wrote to the Guild once again and said, it's time to call the vase back. We need to do restoration on it. And it was taken out of Scott Hall. In 2013, the big vase was once again on exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry for a gala 80th anniversary. Things go quiet until about 2020. The Wiener Museum of Decorative Art down in Hollywood, Florida, does a press release. They're reporting that a colossal Dalton vase is now in the entryway and it is greeting all the visitors. The writer of the article, she goes on to say, surprisingly, there's a second vase. And that vase was on display at the Columbian Exposition back in 1893. And I was at Scott Hall in Northwestern back in 1987. I was able to do a grand reveal of the big vase in Scott Hall. She goes on to say in 2020, I know the big vase is resting in a storeroom down in a sub-basement of the Museum of Science and Industry once again.
So there was a version of our presentation, a version that existed, only about a week ago, that ended here. That ended with the idea that this vase is down there at the Museum of Science and Industry, that we are still interested in it. People like Louise Irvine are still interested in it, and that was sort of where we were going to leave you. However, we got to make a very exciting trip last week. And you can see behind an electron microscope, is that right?
Yes.
You see a little glimpse of porcelain sticking out of that wrapping right behind it there. That's the big vase down at the Museum of Science and Industry, which Kay and I had the pleasure of going to visit in person this past Wednesday. Now, you'll see the enormous part of the vase, that big center body of it, is too large to be moved and stuck behind the microscope right now. But the curator of the museum and some volunteers very kindly pulled the neck of it, its base, the arms, other elements for us to see. And I just want, we both had a really extraordinary time seeing this in person. I wonder if, Kay, you'll share a little bit about what it was like to see this.
Well, I didn't want to cry, but I was just so moved because when we walked in, the curator and her assistant had it on display. It was just glowing. It was so beautiful, and it's so obvious that the Museum of Science and Industry today is taking such good care of it, and it's where it needs to be. And I felt a little bit more at peace that I know it's being well cared for. We did talk a little bit about would it ever be on exhibit again, and the curator said, that's possible. We'll see. But I was thinking that perhaps in 17 years, when the Guild is 150 years old, if there was enough interest, that perhaps we could convince the museum to put it on display down there and give us a little credit. So that might be the way, we leave it today.
So, in terms of what's the point of telling this story. And I think you've all seen that this is really compelling history that this vase connects us to. But we're still learning new things about this vase, about its presence at the University Guild. I already told you a little bit about that frieze. There was another discovery, sort of, we made while we were there. You can see that there are some extra elements down there on that tabletop. There are those pieces, that look over here on the left of the screen. We could not figure out what those were.
Yeah.
The arms of the vase we could see, but those elements we could not figure out where on the vase those went. So we went back to the archives, to that photo of Lunt Library. Look at the base around the vase. So those pieces are part of what we learned on that list is called the curling, to go around the base of the vase. And we really are making new discoveries about this vase that came into the collection over 130 years ago, even while it is in the basement of the Museum of Science and Industry. So the fact that we have this great partnership and collaboration with them means that we can still make these discoveries and talk about this history, even though the vase is not, here in person. And I just want to talk a little bit about, sort of the other importance of this story, which is the history it tells us about the members and all of these generations of women, like Mary Birkeland, who got this dog chew toy in their mouths and would not let go about this vase and its history. And, that hasn't stopped. From Florence Lewis to Bertha Palmer to Emma Rogers and Cornelia Lunt to Louise Irvine, who did this history. Mary Birkeland, of course, who I love this photo of her, where in the background is Cornelia Lunt's portrait. And of course, she doesn't know that she was featured on this slide, Kate Burlingham, too, who, within, less than a month, a couple months of your time with the Guild, was able to crack this entire thing open by going into the archives and looking alphabetically under B for big vase. And that was how we found so many of the letters that you can come up, there's the B, that you can come up and see now as part of our show and tell. And so just the idea that, no, the vase isn't here, and do we wish it was? That's a yes and a no, but, what do we have this amazing story, and what do we have someone who can help us share it with all of you? So thank you all so much for coming today.